have some wonderful speakers here today to headline this session on the idea of an open and free internet for all. Our moderator today is Jeremy Malcolm from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We have Dr. Rj Kumar, the Additional Secretary from the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, to provide a government perspective on this issue. Professor Pradeep Kapur is a professor of international trade, development and security issues at the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland. We have Paul Wilson, Director General at APNIC, and we have Dr. Anya Kovacs, a Director at the International Democracy Project, who will address the barriers to access from a gender perspective. Now I will hand over the floor to Jeremy to start the session.
Thank you very much. So the aim of this session is to discuss various aspects of how a free and open internet for all contributes to digital inclusion. In other words, how can a free and open internet help to create a more inclusive society with equal opportunity across gender, race, geographies, and physical abilities? The most fundamental part of this question is how to broaden access to the internet. In India, there are about 28 internet subscribers per 100 of the population, but 2/3 of those connections are in cities. Connecting users in rural, regional, and isolated areas at an affordable price is much more challenging. Dr. Rj Kumar, Additional Secretary at the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, will be our first speaker and will be addressing some of the measures that the Government of India is taking to propagate the idea of an open and free internet. He will be followed by Professor Pradeep Kapur, visiting clinical professor on international trade, development and security issues at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He's also part of the Maryland Global Initiatives in Cybersecurity project with the acronym MAGIC. And he will give a comparative perspective between India and the United States, drawing on his experiences. For those who follow news from the United States, you may have heard this week that the United States Federal Communications Commission announced that it will be rolling back the rules on net neutrality that it adopted in 2015. So many are worried that this could reduce the openness of the internet by allowing telecommunications providers to give an unfair advantage to internet services, devices and content that contribute to their profits while disadvantaging those that don't. So simple access to the network isn't quite the same as access to an internet that is open and free. The remaining speakers will be looking at other aspects of what makes the internet open and free and what threatens that openness and freedom. Paul Wilson from APNIC, the Asia Pacific Network Information Center, will address some of the threats to the open and free internet that come from a move away from open and interoperable internet standards towards what we sometimes call walled gardens, such as proprietary apps and platforms. Then I'll actually be returning to the podium to follow on from Paul with a few remarks of my own about how giving too much control to these private platforms to decide what content should be permitted on the internet and what content should be censored or prohibited can be dangerous to the idea of a free and open internet. Finally, an open and free internet is a necessary condition for the promotion of digital inclusion, but it isn't sufficient. We also need to consider whether the access that people have is meaningful, whether it actually remediates or contributes to social inequality. For example, do those who are connected have access to content in their own language? Do they have access to educational, financial, and government services that would make a difference to them in their daily lives? So this is a very big question, and although we won't be able to cover all angles of it, our final speaker, Dr. Anya Kovacs from the Internet Democracy Project, will address some of the barriers to access from a gender perspective, in particular the various ways in which the socio-cultural norms can become a barrier to meaningful access to the free and open internet. And then we will close the panel with time for questions and answers. So I would like to encourage all of you to take notes of your questions, which you'll be able to then address to our panelists at the conclusion of the session. So thank you very much for attending, and without any further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone over to our first panelist, Dr. Rj Kumar.
Good morning, friends. My distinguished co-panelists and guests from abroad and guests from India. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's especially, I'm extremely happy because I get to see a lot of old friends after a very long time. So I really feel that this is worth its while just for that reason alone. But I think this is also very important because what we are debating here is an extremely important topic. I think it's extremely important from the Indian context as well as from the global context. When we talk about so much about internet and so much of cyberspace, the reality is that out of 7 billion people, more than 50% are still those who have never seen what internet is. And we are really talking of internet transforming the world. What world is it transforming really? When we look at India, India has seen some rapid transformation and growth of digital technologies, especially in the last 3 years. Today, India is the second largest country in the world after China with in terms of number of internet connections. It is the second largest country, but India is the largest country when it comes to number of people who are not connected. And I think, therefore, this whole need for ensuring that how access is made available to everyone, this question is extremely important to all of us in India. Let me share with you very briefly how in the Indian government we are trying to address this issue. One of our very ambitious project where we are trying to reach internet to everyone is the BharatNet, or the National Optical Fiber Net project, which proposes to take optical fiber to every of the 250,000 gram panchayats, a cluster of villages in the country. And this project is one of the top priority projects, and I'm happy to say that we are now launching in 100,000 gram panchayats. The work has been completed, the fiber has been lit, and the service providers, various service providers have decided to start providing services in 100,000 of these gram panchayats starting this December 2017. Also, further to expedite the remaining 150,000 gram panchayats, work is going on, and several policy level decisions has been taken so that to carry out this project at the grassroots level involves large number of stakeholders, starting from right of way to the extent of demand from the local villages and so forth. To get greater participation, government has come out with a model wherein state governments have now been empowered to take up this project in their own states in an expeditious manner. And we are very hopeful that in another year and a half, we should have the remaining panchayats, most of them also covered. But while this connectivity, broadband connectivity is reaching every village in the country, while the optical fiber is reaching every village in the country, the other big initiative, possibly the biggest program of its kind that is happening and creating access in the country is our Common Service Center program. Today we have over 275,000 kiosks which offer over 300 services through these kiosks. These are micro entrepreneurs, village level entrepreneurs who set up this kiosk, get trained, and start offering services. Over the last 3 to 4 years, these kiosks have provided employment to over 1 million people in the rural area, million rural youth. More importantly, these people have not only themselves got digitally empowered, but they have become the agent of digital change in these villages. They have trained over 15 million people on digital literacy, they have trained over 20 million people on digital payment, and right now they are taking up an exercise in the most interior of villages, not the villages which are along the cities. They have been tasked to go to those villages which are actually remote and not connected with any city whatsoever. Those kind of villages, they are in process of training 60 million people, 60 million households across the country, so that those people are actually able to use technology. India is now, it's kind of a very intriguing and yet exciting proposition that we are having in our villages people who are illiterate but are digitally literate, who are able to use technology to their benefit. And this is the story which our minister relates very often. A BD worker, one of the lowest serving daily wage earner, an old lady of 70, 75 plus in the state of Telangana, had her son working in the Middle East in Dubai, and she wanted to speak to her grandchild, who was obviously with the son in Dubai, and because of digital literacy, she was able to talk to and see the face of her grandson in Dubai through Skype, which was one of the most value-adding thing that could have happened to her through the use of technology. And this is what the huge, big effort to bring people onto the digital, empower them to be able to use digital technologies in the way it makes a difference to them is happening in this country. Another big thing which is happening in the country with respect to access is creating Wi-Fi hotspots. We were woefully short in terms of having Wi-Fi hotspots. In the last 3 years, over 50,000 Wi-Fi hotspots have started in the country. Large number of railway stations, bus stations, public stations, all colleges across the country, colleges, academic institutions, educational institutions are getting connected to Wi-Fi. Our plan is to create 500,000 Wi-Fi hotspots in the country so that the last mile access is more easable. Mobile has been a great game changer, and today the mobile revolution in India is one of the fabled revolution, and this story, especially for friends who may not know this, Indian friends of course know this. In 2000, the target for telephone penetration in the country was set up for 2010, and that penetration the target set for 2010 was 15% of the population should have a phone. For 2010, 15% of the population, which would have in today's terms would have translated to 225 million people should have been having phone, and we would have met the target for 2010. Today we have 1.2 billion phones in the country, over 1.2 billion phones in the country, landline and mobile connected. We have today the cheapest telephone rates in the country, which has spurred the revolution. But most interestingly, in the last 1 year, we have seen dramatic drop in the data rates. And today, like in the voice which happened sometime during the early 2000s, the data rates have also come down so dramatically that India has become again a great hub for use of data by people and increase. So mobile has become the device for access for a large number of people, with 1.2 billion mobile phones in the country. And except a few very far-flung remote villages, mobile access is available. India has done two other things. Knowing that mobile is a device of access, most of our technologies are catering to mobile devices. Yesterday, Prime Minister launched the Umang app, which is a unified app for hundreds of services. But apart from that, we have nearly 900 to 1,000 government services and large number of private services which today you can access on mobile. We have digital payments, various modes of digital payment which can be done on mobile. But most importantly, because we also have people who don't have smartphones yet. Like I said, the internet connectivity is only 500 million. So for the remaining 700 million people who are using plain vanilla feature phones, we have created USSD technology which enables them to access services as well as make digital payment. And India is the only country where you can make a digital payment without a mobile phone and without a credit card or any form of card. You can actually make a payment using your biometrics. So without a device, you are actually able to take services through the net. Friends, let me quickly talk about some of the other policy initiatives which have been taken by government to promote free and open internet. This is an area which is totally 100% FDI. We have multiple global players who participate. We have market environment prevailing and a large number of ISPs, sometimes too many ISPs who are competing for the market. On the with respect to, we have also taken a very firm and clear stand with respect to net neutrality. India was one of the first countries who clearly came out by saying that we do not want to have the net controlled by any one or more than one players. And we have a clear policy with respect to net neutrality. We also have taken several steps to see how the data is made available to people. India has an open data policy. It has an open data platform in which more than 100,000 government data resources are available openly for use by public. And this has helped a lot of people to use these data resources and create value for other citizens. In addition to that, we also support the open source in government. Government has announced the open source policy which gives clear preference to open source. Before developing any application within the government, we first look at the open source solutions that are relevant and applicable. In fact, I can say in the last 3 years, practically I can hardly think of any solution which has been used in or developed in Government of India which is not on open source. And however, if there is need where there are no open source solutions, there is dependence on other solutions also. So we have a clear preference for open source as well. We have an open API policy where most applications that we create provide open APIs so that others who want to use that information depending on access and authentication considerations, we enable people to use APIs to provide services. Let me just conclude by making one other point. And I think that's something which is becoming extremely important. Friends, today we are in a situation where the world's biggest companies are neither automobile companies nor oil companies. They are all data companies. The Googles, the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Apples, the Baidus, the Alibabas, the Tencents. They are the most valuable companies in the world. And why are they valuable? Because they have immense amount of data. Immense amount of data which has enabled them to create new business models, to enable them to create value for their users, but more importantly, much greater value for themselves. The question is, whose data is it? And how much, when we are talking of free and open and free internet, does it mean that some organizations are able to colonize or monopolize on the data that is available? In the end, this data belongs to the user. It belongs to you and me. And if it belongs to you and me, how does my data give value to me? How should it, if some other organization who's using my data and creating so much of value, should the user also not be entitled to part of that value? Today, when we look at most of these, platforms, content platforms, they take consent. And I don't know how many of you have actually seen consent. Does the open and free internet means you take my blanket consent and take all my data? Does it really require to have such extensive consents? Is the consent directly related to the exact service which I am being offered? I think these are questions which need to be asked. There is other question. In a global free and open internet, when platforms are, global platforms are offering service, how is the interest of a user, say in India, protected? What remedy does he have if he has to go and pursue in the courts of a third country far off and get his rights enforced? How does he do that? So how do we actually address these questions, and these, given the fact that these are the most important, valuable resource of tomorrow? Like some say that data is the new oil, whatever it is, but if these are the questions that need to be, if my resource is with you, do I have the right to take my data and move on to another resource? This is one. And the second important point, which is today coming, is the whole right of privacy. The question in India, the Supreme Court has already clearly said that privacy is a fundamental right. But in this open and free internet world, how do we ensure that this fundamental right of citizens is protected? In India, and I think in several other parts, European Union has taken the lead. It has come out with the GDPR rules, which are going to get implemented next year. Several other countries have come out with some privacy rules. But I think the question is both privacy as well as user rights over his data, the value of his data. And we also in India are in process of this debate and churning. A committee has been set up under the leadership of eminent Supreme Court, former Supreme Court Judge, Justice Sri B. N. Krishna, who's looking into these issues and trying to come out. But I think this is as we are getting more and more digitalized, as we are getting more and more, while there is definitely need to have an open and free internet, there is equal need to make sure that the interests of the users are protected so that he is not shortchanged in this whole process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar. And now I'd like to invite up Professor Pradeep Kapur, again, a visiting clinical professor, International Trade Development and Security Issues at the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And thank you for the introductory talk. We have been listening to a lot of good speeches. Even yesterday, we had the opportunity to listen to the keynote addresses by the Prime Minister of India, the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, the Minister for Law, Justice and IT, and later on in the day by the MOS and a large number of speakers who all made very good points. I wish to thank the Ministry, MIT, for putting together this very big effort. And before I start, I just want to mention that Dr. Ajay Kumar may not realize it, but we do share quite a few things in common. We are from the same alma mater, though in different geographies. He's IIT Kanpur, I think, and I'm IIT Delhi. Slightly different time zones, not too far away. And we also share the same background in civil service in India. He is from the IAS, I am from the IFS, Indian Foreign Service. And incidentally, quite a few Indians may not realize it who are present in this hall, but these are probably two of the most difficult exams in the world. The entrance exam for the IIT, I was told last year had 1.8 million applicants, and the entrance exam for the civil service has about 500,000 applicants for maybe just over 500, 600 jobs. I have not seen any other country. I have traveled a lot. I have worked in a large number of countries as a foreign service officer, as an ambassador, as a diplomat. But I have not seen this sort of competition in any country for any educational institution or for any job. Now, I work in the US. I'm a professor there, as has been mentioned. We have this center which is called MAGIC, Maryland Global Initiatives in Cybersecurity. Maryland is a big happening place for work in the field of cybersecurity. We again have this computer sciences department where, incidentally, the head is again from IIT, and there are a large number of IIT professors in the entire University of Maryland. It is a very big university, very prominent university, and very well known in this field, because the root server for USA is also managed by the university. Now, what I want to do today here is the following. Talk briefly about what is the global situation today, and then go on to how it is evolving and what will be the global situation in the forthcoming future. But most important of all, what I want all of us here to think a little bit, to pause, to reflect, is about what should be the global situation. Now, we have heard in great detail about the situation in India, about how it is evolving, how India is in the frontiers of technology, of IT, in so many aspects. But what is the situation on the ground is what I'd like all of us to think and reflect a little bit. There is still a lot of poverty, as we all know. There is still a lot of illiteracy, even though there may be a lot of digital literacy, as was pointed out earlier. The healthcare conditions leave a lot to be desired, sanitation conditions also. Electricity access is still not available to a very large percentage of the population. Quality of infrastructure, roads, blackouts, water, clean water, drinking water, all these are great challenges. There's also increasing violence. Every day we hear of new acts of terrorism, extremism all over the world. Now, India, to a very great extent, because of what we even heard about yesterday, the great spirit of tolerance for not decades or centuries, but for thousands of years, having all the religions of the world here, having all the different immigrants from different parts of the world for thousands of years, the contribution to global jihad or global extremism from India, in spite of having such a large number of different religions here, and we are the second largest population in terms of Muslims in the world after Indonesia. Yet, I hear of a larger number of people involved with global terrorism from countries like USA or UK or Australia or Singapore or Thailand or Cambodia or anywhere, France, Germany. I'm not even talking about Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or Iran or Malaysia or any of those other countries. There are a few thousand every time the figures come out. 3,000 from this country, 5,000 there, 10,000 there. So that makes me feel very proud of our ancient traditions and culture, that the number of people who get swayed by these aspects of getting involved with terrorism is still minuscule, in the single digits or double digits so far. It's not even reached 3 digits. And let's hope the situation continues like that. But the landscape globally is changing. The threats of traditional war and warfare still exist, as we see every day. Lots of talk about nuclear war between North Korea and the USA, and flashpoints in the Southeast China Seas, East China Seas, South China Seas. But what is a real threat to the world, which is already being manifested in different corners, is cyber warfare. That itself, in my view, is becoming a real threat. And the incidence of cyber hacking is increasing day by day. Every few weeks we hear of some massive hacks. Some personal stories: I was traveling from the US to Europe to get my visa renewal done, and the entire immigration system of the US was hacked completely. All the data of all the federal employees was hacked by China. So they could not issue any visas anywhere in the world. And what was supposed to have been a 2-day turnaround for me in Europe turned out to be more than 2 weeks, because they could not put back their system on track for more than 2 weeks. So all over the world, nobody was able to get visas for the US because it was completely hacked. And when it was reopened after a matter of more than 2 weeks, what was the message which came? From some agency called Yatri Online or something. So could probably have been some Indians working. Yatri means traveler in India, in Hindi, in Sanskrit. So they restored the system slowly, and then people started getting their visas, and I was also able to go back. I did enjoy my time in France in the meantime, but that was incidental. Another day, I was at the University of Maryland, and suddenly we received this message that the entire electricity system had collapsed. There were no reasons. They could not find out what was the reason. Later they learned it was experiments going on in hacking by some other countries. So the White House, the entire federal government area of Washington, D.C., the entire University of Maryland, this daytime, around 9 o'clock the hacking started, everything went, in the sense, no bijli, no AC. And we were told to vacate the university by noon, because they said by 2 p.m., even the electric gates will not operate, and you may not even be able to evacuate yourself from the building. So they had kept the gates functional till 2 p.m. with emergency electricity. And when I got out onto the road, I saw the whole of traffic in Washington was in a total mess. There was so much of panic, so much of chaos, so much of traffic jams everywhere. Everybody just wanting to rush back home, because nobody knew what had happened, how it had happened. We have all heard about the interference in the elections in different countries. And being in the US, I can talk a little more about what's been happening in the presidential elections in the US. There's still a lot of investigation going on by special counsels, and a lot of it has started coming out as to how primarily one country was able to hack the entire process of elections, of democracy, of free speech, and influence the entire course of elections at a cost which is literally peanuts, minuscule. For a few tens of thousands of dollars, they were able to buy up space and ads in all the data agencies which our previous speaker mentioned, Facebook and Twitter and Google, and it's all coming out now for $20,000, for $100,000, for $200,000. They put out so many ads that it influenced large segments of the population of Afro-Americans, for example, whom I was very surprised because I was sitting with a very senior academic Afro-American, and this was around lunchtime on the day of the elections. Incidentally, unlike in India, the elections in US open up a long period before, almost a month before. So you can go any day and vote. And the election day, what is announced as the election day is only the last day of the elections. So you have 1 month, full month to vote. So on the last day of the elections, we are sitting with this person, having lunch, and I asked him that you must have voted already, because I thought there would be a lot of enthusiasm to vote. And he said, no, I'll vote after this lunch, probably. So that was the sort of impact it had on people who would earlier have gone out very enthusiastically and voted for one side or the other, were suddenly, particularly one side, were suddenly not enthused enough because of all this continuous barrage of ads and influencing through the electronic media, through the social media, all written out by very high quality expert psychologists, I'm sure, because I've seen those ads, and it's very, very impressive to see how they could have formatted or formulated or conceived of those ads, the conceptualization itself. Now, on the positive side, what do we see is that there is a lot of change, positive change, as has also been seen in the discourses earlier. And the pace of change is very phenomenal. If we compare it in the historical context, look at it just, with the idea to understand how it's happening. What has been happening from year 0, for example, to the year 2015 is less than what has happened between the year 2015 to today in terms of historical pace of change, evolution, innovations. So there is tremendous amount of innovation, there's tremendous amount of improvement in the quality of life. But the challenges which we all have to think about and reflect and see how to face in the future are also very, very enormous. Now, what will be the global situation? I think we again need to reflect a little bit about the future. We have heard of a lot of mention about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The UN converted the Millennium Development Goals into the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were to be met by 2000. And then they extended the date to 2010, and then 2010 they realized that they had been able to meet some percentage of those Sustainable Development Goals. So then they set up some expert committees which came up with this concept of changing the Millennium Development Goals into Sustainable Development Goals starting with 2015. Now the whole world is faced with this task, and what is going to help and what is not going to help is, I guess, the change maker and the deciding factor is going to be the digital aspects. And India, fortunately, digital India, financial inclusion, in all these aspects, we are doing very well. There is this book which is written, Abundance, by the Singularity University. There's a university in US, very pioneering university. Some of the bright students in this room who are here, I'm very happy to see there are a lot of young faces in this audience, should aspire to go to that university. It will be a very good training and good, very useful, building up your thoughts and careers. So some of the people in that university came out with this book called Abundance. Abundance is a sort of a era where you think that there's going to be a lot of abundance of everything, healthcare, education, infrastructure, whatever medical needs are there of the people, etc. Now, comparing USA and India, we have a lot of similarities. We are both nations of immigrants. We are, just a small story again. When Alexander came to India and defeated the emperor here, Porus, he stayed on for a long time, almost 1 year. When he decided to go back, 65% of his army stayed back in India. So from that time, we have had large amount of immigration in India. We have more Parsis in India than in Iran. I was working in Nepal, in the embassy there. We have more Nepalese of the working age group in India than in Nepal. We have maybe, tens and tens of millions of Bangladeshis in India. So large number of Afghanis, Iraqis, from all countries we have had for thousands of years, and the Gangetic Plain has been the most densely populated part of the world for the last maybe 5,000 or 7,000 years. Now talking about US and India, we were evolving on similar paths, which is net neutrality, and we had similar policies, similar regulations, similar laws. Suddenly, the US seems to have taken a reverse track, like was mentioned by Jeremy recently. They are going to decide on December 14th whether the US as a country is going to go ahead with net neutrality or not. And who is the villain in the piece? Ajit Pai, an Indian origin person who is chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. So let us see what is the outcome. Unfortunately, under the current administration, there have been a lot of negative decisions in terms of walking out of climate change agreement, in terms of so many other negative steps on free trade like NAFTA and TPP. I will not elaborate on those. We are not concerned with here. But overall, what picture I want to paint now, I come to the conclusion, is the following. What should be the situation globally? What is our vision? If we think about it for a minute, what is the utopia that we can dream of, we can envision in our minds about the future? Is the net neutrality and all this cyber progress overall positive or negative? Issues of privacy. Now, the argument in one sentence which I want to put forward to you is the following, that for development, we need net neutrality. Why do we need net neutrality? Because it will benefit the masses. Now, if we have net control for the extremists and the terrorists to still make use of the media to penetrate and influence the minds of people, is not going to be blocked easily, because these agencies again are going to sell themselves for a few dollars, for small amounts of dollars. And these dollars are more easily accessible to the terrorists and extremists than to the common man. The common man does not have that sort of resources. So the positives of net neutrality and access free and open internet for all is more for the common man, for the poor man, all over the world, in India, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, in America, everywhere. There is a lot of poverty in all these developed countries also. And if we don't have this sort of net neutrality and open access and free and open internet for all, it is not going to benefit mankind at all. We have to manage how to control access to extremists, manage, monitor, control, limit, and issues of privacy also similarly have to be managed. But that does not mean that we have to put any obstacles in the path of free and open internet. That is my hypothesis. That's what I want to propose before you, and for you to not just think about, but act upon. Because even in the US, for example, if a large number of people start acting upon this issue of going back on net neutrality, it may again be stopped. Now, I'll end with a quote from, guess who? Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was a visionary beyond his times. Now, when he was asked by the cabinet ministers of that time that, Bapuji, You know, we have so many difficult problems every day, and it becomes so difficult to take decisions. What is your advice? What was Bapuji's advice? I'm going to read that out. Recall the face of the poorest and weakest man or woman whom you may have seen, and ask yourself if the step you contemplate is going to be of any use to him or her. Will he or she gain anything by it? Will it restore him, her, to a control over their own life and destiny? In other words, will it lead to Swaraj, freedom for the hungry and spiritually starving millions? Then, I'm still quoting, the quotation continues, I'm not saying anything of my own. This is Bapuji's words. Then you will find your doubts and your self melt away. Now, this expresses a very profound social thought. And I would propose that India, like it proposed the International Day of Yoga in the UN, should propose this as the vision statement or the guiding statement, mission statement for the SDGs and for the development banks like the World Bank, IMF, ADB, IADB, African Development Bank, etc., all the development banks all over the world, as part of their guiding statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kapur, sorry. Mr. Paul Wilson from APNIC.
Thank you, Jeremy. Dr. Rj Kumar, Ambassador Kapur, Dr. Anja Kovacs. Thank you very much. Thank you to the hosts. Thank you for all being here at this wonderful event. As Dr. Rj Kumar said, it's a fantastic opportunity to see so many old friends in India and from outside. This session is about the idea of an open and free internet, and I've decided to take that sort of literally to talk about the idea, because open and free is an idea. It's an ideal, in fact, one that I think we can only hope to match for the internet as a whole. But at the same time, open and free is something that we can achieve, at least in certain global processes, especially locally in our own access to and work with the internet. And that's a very important distinction, I think, when we're talking about open and free, what it means and where it can be. I've got a few thoughts about the history of the internet. It started and it boomed in the first place, not exactly because it was completely open and free, but only because it was closer to open and free than any of the others at the time, and there were quite a few others. The internet beat its competitors, which fell aside because of the internet's success. So open and free was an ideal of the internet at the time, but not exactly reached. But because the internet is small, we can actually pretty easily observe those characteristics as they were at the time and think about them. I mean, the internet was definitely open. You didn't need permission of the internet to join because there was actually no such thing. All you needed was a place to connect to. So yes, it was definitely a more open network, more open than other networks with centralized controls. But on the other hand, you actually did need someone's permission, someone's consent, so you can't say that it was totally open at that time. As for free, well, there were rules. It was an academic network at the start, and the only way to join was to be an academic or research institution or a member of one. So the early internet wasn't free of rules either. But it was quite famously a trusting environment and not exactly rule-bound by any means. But in the other sense of free, the internet was free of fees, with no fees payable to the internet for connectivity or participation, because again, there was no such thing, no such place to get your permission or pay your fees. In financial terms, you did have to pay, and quite a lot of money at the time, for modems and data links and maybe for the direct costs of your connectivity, but there were no costs at all, and this is critical, there were no costs at all for intellectual property or for licenses for using internet technology, because internet standards were freely available, and that was absolutely critically important at the time. And it still is, as I'll show. So the internet started out as quite open and quite free, and it arguably became more open and free as time went on. It became more open as the limitation to academic use was dropped, and that happened at different times in, for instance, the USA and in other places. And that quickly allowed a huge diversity of people representing almost all sectors to join and to become stakeholders in the internet. As the rules were dropped in the 80s and into the 90s, the prices of equipment and connectivity dropped, and open competition emerged in different places at different times again. But that brought down costs and provided more choice. So at that time, anyone could join in many places, and also even in complete anonymity, simply by paying an ISP for the service, again without permission. So I think it's true that with commercialization, actually, the internet became more free by these measures. It's where we saw the idea of permissionless innovation, as the Internet Society calls it, the idea that not only could anyone join the internet and be part of and participate in the internet, but they could also contribute to it through innovation without, again, needing to ask anyone's permission. That is openness and freedom. So in the many years since, though, I think we know that the internet's grown in many parts of the world into almost all corners of the world. Initially, that happened under the noses of governments, almost without governments even knowing or noticing. But now it's growing in a way that is very well known and always regulated in some way or another. So what I'm saying is that the degrees of openness and freedom on the internet have varied to make the internet more or less open and more or less free at different times and in different places, and also in terms of individual services on the internet. So you've got different freedoms associated, for instance, with voice over IP in some places than other services. And that's why I say that what we're talking about here is an ideal of freedom and openness, because it may be practically impossible to reach it purely across the whole internet at any time, but it is still a principle that we can deliberately pursue and institute and measure and protect and preserve locally in any given geography for the services, some or all of the services that we might be using on the internet, and that's according to our own sort of priorities of importance. So I want to explore the ideal on two fronts. One is in the area of internet standards, open standards, as Jeremy mentioned, and also in internet governance. So on standards, I mentioned before that the free availability of open standards was a key to the internet's success. And that is certainly true, that at a time when the cost of entry to proprietary networks was very high, internet software was available for free to run on almost any platform that existed at the time. That came from a sort of cooperative ethic in the internet in terms of software, of open source and software sharing. And also from the fact that the use of the core standards themselves didn't cost money. They were, as I say, open standards. So that was critical. And it was critical in terms of TCP/IP, the basic network layer of the internet that allows connectivity in the first place. And then also in terms of the applications that were in use at the time, mail and news and file transfer and so on, these sort of basic applications on which the internet was built. But then very quickly it became much truer in the first set of standards that brought masses onto the internet. These were the World Wide Web standards of HTTP and HTML. And that is what created the boom of the internet, prompted the creation of many, many other open standards for media and interconnection and authentication, for communications and so forth. For almost anything that was going on the web, there were standards to make sure that interoperability, that openness was there. And today we actually have two organisations, very important organisations, which continue the work on open standards, the IETF for a whole set of internet protocol standards and the W3C for the World Wide Web standards. And it's really critical that their work continue because these standards really are at the essence of the internet. So if you doubt that, just think of the fact that there is just one World Wide Web, one single huge set of servers and of pages that are accessible on your phones and your tablets and PCs and all sorts of other devices, regardless of what software or operating system or manufacturer you have. That's the beauty of the web standards, and you can contrast that, for instance, with some of the frustrations we see today in the lack of standards, for instance, in instant messaging. So if you want to use instant messaging, you've got to choose WhatsApp or Signal or Skype or Facebook or Google or Snapchat or MSN or AOL, if those things even exist anymore, even though each of those things does basically the same thing, but for some reason they weren't standardized. There actually is a standard, it's called XMPP or Jabber, and that's got the features that we want of openness and interconnection, multi-platform operation and so forth, but it came a bit too late to avoid the other standards which became dominant. And I guess there are also other commercial advantages. We have bundling of some messenger software with other platforms, such as on Facebook, for instance. So you've got a contrast there between the standards we enjoy and we take for granted, such as the web standards, and the standards that we don't enjoy because they don't exist or they're not being used. And somehow we kind of accept that, but I think it's worth being aware of the difference there. Talking about Facebook, that's another important case of a lack of standards. Facebook is ubiquitous and it's kind of a de facto standard for all of us for social media, but it's not an open standard. So Facebook doesn't interconnect with Google or with Allo or MySpace, if that one even exists anymore. Again, there was a standards effort. There was something called Open Social. But like Jabber, that didn't go very far, and probably for the same reasons of timing and commercial factors and so on. But I think in both cases, in instant messaging, social networking, openness and freedom have actually suffered due to the lack of successful open standards for both of those sets of functions. And that is why there are movements today, both in civil society and also in governance, in certain governments, to support and promote open standards wherever possible, and to make sure, I hope, that we don't take open standards for granted in the way that I've shown here. So moving on to governance, there's one respect at the global level where I think the internet has definitely become more open, that is, than it used to be. And that's with respect to multi-stakeholder governance. I mean, the internet was a very laissez-faire place. It was open to all stakeholders, but it didn't represent all stakeholders by any means. And I think a huge contribution of the 2000s was the discovery of the multi-stakeholder process as part of the internet, and an appreciation that multi-stakeholderism, if we want to take advantage and pursue it, is more than just openness. It's actually an active effort at inclusion to ensure that the internet population is representative of the rest of the population, or the global population, and also to ensure that structural means can be introduced to reflect that representation, the multi-stakeholder representation in multi-stakeholder decision-making. So I think that's something that has improved. It's got a long way to go, but it has improved in these days, at least in the 2000s. But these days, actually, the internet stakes are getting much higher, and the stakes in openness and freedom are much higher as well. We all know about critical events that have happened in recent times, political and geographic and commercial and criminal events which have affected freedom and openness. You know, they've caused internet shutdowns, cyber attacks and accidents and censorship, infiltration and surveillance. And the thing is, we know that the necessary responses, or a response is necessary to these situations, but whether they're reactive or defensive or preventative responses to those threats, they can also affect freedom and openness mostly negatively, or often negatively, and that's something to embark on with very open eyes. So I think the question is whether freedom and openness are being compromised today. Are they increasing or decreasing overall on the internet that we know and love. Frankly, I don't think that the internet is living in times which are very high on freedom and openness at the moment. It's very constrained, increasingly by hard rules, by economic and regulatory conditions and processes. This multi-stakeholder model, which has achieved quite a lot, for instance, the recent Anya transition process within the ICANN structure, it's still yet to solve many questions about participation and representation and decision-making. And at the same time, we've got a strengthening of sovereign rights on the internet, which have had governments taking decisions, frankly, in isolation to other stakeholder groups sometimes, and delivering decisions sometimes that fragment the internet and put at risk some of the fundamental principles of internet architecture. So, as I said at the outset, as an ecosystem, I think the internet really is far too big and diverse to ever be declared to be fully open and free. This is an idea, it's an ideal state. And maybe it's a bit like us asking, for instance, for a democratic world. You know, we can all work in our own countries and our institutions for democratic process, but we can't really expect it to be achieved globally uniformly at any time very soon, I'm afraid. For that matter, maybe it's also a bit like network neutrality, an ideal which is desirable, possibly not implementable, and certainly not, again, in a uniform, idealistic way across the internet. But the point here is that we aim and should be committed towards an ideal of open and free internet, because it's been demonstrated time after time that this is not only the reason for the internet's outstanding success, but it's also the healthiest and most sustainable way for the incredible internet ecosystem to grow and to keep flourishing in future. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Oh, your phone. Is this your phone? So we're running a little late on time, so what I'm going to do is to abbreviate my presentation to 5 minutes. Could we have the slide up, please? Here we go, and the next one, please. So I'm going to be talking about how internet platforms can be both, they're integral to the open and free internet, but they can also be a threat to it if we rely on them too much. Now, this is a diagram that illustrates the technical architecture of the internet. This, the bright spots are like large servers online, and as you can see, there's not really a central authority there. But if we can move to the next slide, that doesn't map very well to the way that we want to govern the internet, because the way that particularly governments expect to be able to govern the internet is based on this map, which looks very different to the previous map. It's a country-by-country method of governing, and it doesn't really work as well as governments would like. So if we can move to the next slide, instead governments tend to rely on platforms to govern the internet, rather than making a law that they try to apply across the world. They'll just put pressure on a platform that exists across the whole world and ask that platform to make decisions that represent their national policies. Now, this is what happens when a video is taken down on YouTube pursuant to the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Now, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or DMCA, is not an international law. It's a law of one country, the United States. But most platforms throughout the world will obey this law as if it was international law. So that's fine for the United States and fine for the platforms that follow its law. But what about other countries that may be smaller? They can't get platforms to do the same thing. If we move to the next slide, this is a picture of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the Turkish nation. Now, Turkey does not like to permit criticism of the founder of its nation on the internet, and they will frequently request platforms to take down criticism of Ataturk. But of course, most countries in the world have no inclination to do that. China, when it has criticisms of its policies online, will do more than just request platforms to take it down. They will in fact block those platforms so that those within China can't access those platforms. Now that's fine, but if we want to respect human rights, we can't just block the internet. Another example of internet blocking occurred in the United States, interestingly, occurred a couple of months ago when the Charlottesville riots occurred, which resulted in the blocking of a neo-Nazi website called The Daily Stormer. The Daily Stormer firstly had its domain name taken away by its registrar. Then when it tried to move it to a different registrar, which was Google, not only did the same thing, but locked the domain name so it couldn't be transferred anywhere else. Essentially, this took the site off the internet. So let's move to the next slide where I've already explained what happened. The reason why these companies did that is because there was a lot of public pressure, and if they didn't remove the Daily Stormer from their services, they would be attacked in turn. Next slide. Cloudflare is another company that removed services to the Daily Stormer following a lot of pressure. And the CEO of Cloudflare was worried about this. He wrote in his blog, literally, I woke up in a bad mood and decided that someone shouldn't be allowed on the internet. No one should have that power. So another thing that results from these platforms having such power to deny people the ability to operate on the internet is that laws can be directed against particular platforms. And there's a law that my organization, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, is fighting at the moment called SESTA. Now, SESTA is effectively directed at just one online platform called Backpage.com, which is accused of facilitating sex trafficking. So it's, but we don't think it's a wise law, because rather than being directed at sex traffickers, it's directed at this platform that some sex traffickers may use, but which a lot of legitimate users also use. So we don't think that's a good idea. So I've explained how the centrality of these platforms makes them a locus for censorship. When censorship occurs through an agreement between multiple providers, we call that shadow regulation. And shadow regulation can also be what happens when governments pressure platforms to regulate content. The government may not want to do it directly through lawmaking, because that can be a long process, it can be controversial. Rather, they will just put pressure on platforms to voluntarily censor content. In the next slide, we can see how this kind of pressure can be brought at various levels against various sorts of platforms. For example, the web host, the certificate authority, an upstream internet provider, a content delivery network such as Cloudflare, a search engine, DNS operators, ISPs, even payment service providers, and platforms such as Facebook. So there are many different levels at which private operators have the ability to censor speech. Sometimes this does not make sense. So this is the logo of a heavy metal band with the unfortunate name of ISIS. But there are private platforms that will ban you from buying merchandise from this heavy metal band because the name is similar to the name of the terrorist organization. Now, the private policies that these platforms use to ban you from buying ISIS merchandise are not open. There's no public consultation process, as there would be in the case of lawmaking. So this is a case essentially of private lawmaking by platforms that affects your rights online, and you don't really have a say in it. Another example that affects India in particular is the laws, not the laws, but the private policies of platforms such as credit card companies and domain registries about selling pharmaceuticals online. So there should probably be some kind of policy about buying pharmaceuticals across borders, but that policy should probably be developed in a multi-stakeholder fashion, as Paul spoke about, rather than by private policies of credit card companies and DNS providers. But that's what we have at the moment. And these policies are guided by the US pharmaceutical industry, so it's not inclusive at all. We do think that platforms should have the ability to remove content without having to wait for lawmakers to tell them what to do. But on the next slide, we can see we've developed a set of principles for how we think they should do that. We call them the Manila Principles on Intermediary Liability. And if you'd like, I won't have time to speak about them now, but if you'd like to Google that, you can see what processes we think that private platforms should follow when they are asked to take down speech from the internet. And finally, the last slide shows the process that we think that internet organizations should go through if they're trying to make rules for the internet that don't have the same kind of transparency and accountability of a public lawmaking process. Nevertheless, we think that they should follow a similar process that provides transparency, due process, and inclusion of multiple stakeholders. And these are a summary of the principles that we suggest that such organizations should follow. So I have raced through this presentation in about a third of the time that I would normally take. If you would like more information, please do come up to me afterwards and I can direct you to some other resources. So thank you very much. And I'm going to pass on now to our final panelist, Dr. Anya Kovacs, the director of the Internet Democracy Project.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'll try and match the racing. I'm not sure I'll be successful, though. Today is a special occasion for me. I think it's the first time since the IGF in 2007 that India has brought so many people from the internet governance community in India and abroad to India. And that's my area of work. And it's the first time that it's in Delhi, which I consider my hometown. So it's a great honor for me to be invited by the Indian government, my adoptive home country, to stand here today. I've worked in India for more than a decade now, and have always been very inspired both by the spirit of the people and by my colleagues in civil society working on the same issues of internet and human rights as we are, and the enormous quality of the work that they produce. So I'm by no means representing them, but our work very much draws from their work as well, and I'm very grateful to this opportunity to share some of this here. What I wanted to do was to approach this topic of a free and open internet for all from a slightly different angle, which I think has had less attention in the meeting so far, and that's that of gender barriers to access. And I think India by no means is unique. I think those barriers exist around the world, actually. But as in many cases, the great diversity and challenges in India are a very good place to study this. We have a gender mobile ownership gap of about 36%, according to data of the GMSA. That's one of the higher ones in the world. We see this across South Asia. Some countries in Africa have an equally big gap. But again, to make clear that a gender gap when it comes to the internet is by no means limited to our region. The ITU has figures show that the gender gap in internet use has actually grown worldwide from 11% in 2013 to 12% in 2016. So we're not really doing better, and it is a broad phenomenon. What's important then is to ask what exactly is going on. And I think merely looking at access to infrastructure is not really going to answer that question. To some extent, we already know access to resources is gendered when it doesn't come to the internet as well, right? We know this even if you look at who's getting to drive the family car. If there's only one car in a family, very often it's the male head of the household. So these things are not new, right? But what we see, and I think this is where more of the clue lies to how to resolve this gap, is that once the infrastructural issue is solved, which the government is already working on to resolve in our country, what we see is very often that women still have unequal access. And so what we want to see is more attention for how social-cultural norms anywhere in the world actually influence the extent to which women or sexual minorities, for that matter, participate in the internet. Just to give you an example from our own research, we looked at mobile phone use by young women in fairly conservative rural communities in North India. And what we found there was that their use was tremendously restricted. And the main reason was that their families were concerned about what new spaces for privacy that mobile phones allow young people would actually do to the reputation of the girls in particular and to their family more broadly. And because of these concerns, while many of those girls were actually allowed to use phones, they were only allowed to do so under supervision and somewhat ironically at home. So for them, the mobile aspect of the phone kind of disappeared. What we also saw there was that for the same reasons there was a lot of, almost a taboo around the use of Facebook. So you might know that in India, only about 25% of all Facebook users are women, and unlike in most other countries where it's about half. And again, this had a lot to do with Facebook being seen as a space where new relationships could be cultivated with people without necessarily the knowledge or approval of families. And so WhatsApp was a much more accepted means of communication because WhatsApp is a communication usually with a list of contacts that are already on the phone. And so these were known people. What we also saw as a consequence of all of this is that girls put an enormous emphasis on being responsible users. And while obviously in a way responsible use is something one would encourage for all, it also seemed to come from a real sense that their spaces for exploration were restricted and that they were conscious that they shouldn't be seen to be exploring freely because that might actually lead to a backlash against their use in general. So they try to legitimize the use by constantly saying, but we're responsible. Another angle of this problem, and this is again something we see worldwide, is the technology-enabled violence against women. Everywhere in the world, we've heard of what some people call trolling, what we call verbal online abuse of women. This is a worldwide problem and phenomenon that really restricts the free use of the internet for women everywhere. What's important to realize, though, is that, again, online abuse of women or technology-enabled violence of women does not take the same form everywhere. And so while trolling might be something that affects especially women who are already vocal on the internet, who have certain resources at their disposal, in the same rural communities that I was talking about, actually mobile phone harassment is one of the biggest challenges. And the government of UP set up a helpline specifically to deal with these problems. In 4 years' time, they got more than 600,000 calls, and more than 5.5 lakhs, so 550,000 of those were about either getting missed calls or calls from strangers who wanted to strike up a conversation, again, with young women. It's a very different challenge than, for example, online trolling, and gets far less attention. Also, the phenomenon of revenge porn in India sometimes takes a different form. So in most countries, we think of, when we talk about revenge porn, we think of women's naked images being shared or the head of a woman being morphed on a picture of a naked body. We have, unfortunately, in India sites also where pictures of fully clothed women are used on Facebook pages to comment on the outlines of their body, the way their breasts might show under their clothes, etc. And again, if you come from a conservative community, that potentially has, this potentially actually leads to the ruining of your reputation and your family. Why I'm outlining this in detail is because I think the two trends also feed into each other, right? To some extent, families are right to be concerned about what's going to happen when girls go online. And this poses a real dilemma if we want to actually resolve that gender gap. Why I'm pointing all of this out is because the bigger message is, I think, thinking about the open and free internet for all is not just about nuts and bolts. It is really also about offline dynamics and the way those get replicated on the internet. It also means, if you start to take these broader challenges into account, that we have to be really careful about how we are going to respond to these challenges. I think too often our approach ends up being protectionist, and that's quite dangerous. As part of that, there are many people in India and elsewhere again who actually advocate for more restrictions on speech in law. We don't agree with those. We actually think that India already has an excellent framework to deal with challenges of online abuse, for example, from that perspective. We actually have one of the strongest anti-revenge porn laws in the world, I would say, and already since 2008, so long before many other countries did. The same thing you see, I think, with the emphasis on the platforms. Jeremy was explaining how often if you ask platforms to censor content for you, they end up taking down things that you don't necessarily want to see restricted. So restrictions in that sense are not necessarily the best solution. Neither are telling women not to share their images, not to go online, not to speak and reach out to other people. What we want to see is a more substantive approach to empowerment. And so, for example, when it comes to law, that means talk more about data protection, which several of my co-panelists have already raised. It also means, I think, that, for example, in capacity building, we really need to think about these social dynamics. You cannot think that merely telling women what is the technical knowledge they need to know to be able to use the internet is going to be sufficient if at the same time their broader social circles are constantly going to tell them that you cannot explore this space freely. If we are not going to change that, though, I also think that women are not going to be able to take advantage of the benefits of the internet in the way that we would like them to. And so if we are going to continue to emphasize empowerment and want everybody to really have access to the empowerment that the internet can provide, we need to integrate both offline change with online access. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya. So we have time left for a couple of questions. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to direct a question to any of our panelists? There are microphones at the front here, so if you would like to ask... Oh, no, there's also a microphone coming around. So, and the panelists can use those microphones to respond.
Hello. Hello. Good morning. I'm Rajesh Mishra. I'm from Department of Telecom, director over there. My question is, as is very much clear from the discussion we have today, that today's internet is not net neutral. So whether we are going towards net neutrality or we are moving away from net neutrality, and then how would you relate universality of internet and net neutrality? Anyone who can answer?
Well, the global trend, if you see today, is going to continue towards net neutrality. Though some cases of slippage and reverse, backing will happen, such as in the US currently what we are seeing. But if you see historically, the GPS, all the other developments which have taken place, innovations, the spread, and initially it was only, for example, military content. Then slowly it came out into the civil domains. And today it is so pervasive, it is available to everybody. So at very, very low cost. So the costs are dropping significantly. Your smartphone, for example, the access that you have to data and information today is equivalent to what the most powerful man in the world, the president of US, had. 90% of the data a common man can have through his smartphone today, what he had a few years back. So that is a sort of progress which is being made. So net neutrality is here to stay, is here to expand, and that is the only way to go, that is to go forward. Countries which are very, very important in the global scenario like India, and which are going to impact the global decision making more and more in the future, are going positively, as we have seen from the statements by all the political leaders. Countries like China, Russia will have some controls, but ultimately the social media and the pressure of the people will prevail, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Govind. My question is, first of all, I want to thank the excellent panel discussion here, which is truly multi-stakeholder panel here. We are talking about more and more free and open internet, but we see more and more shutdowns and blocking of the internet is also increasing day by day in different parts of the world and in India. So my question is how to curb those kind of things, whether it should be curbed in a very unique way or what should be the way forward for that.
So, on the issue of net neutrality in India, we have a very clear and decision, and this discussion came up, and we have a very clear decision on this. So I think we have a settled position as far as we are concerned in India. However, I think it is interesting to see what technology changes will come in the future, and you will continue to have this. If you ask me, you will continue to have this question and the debate going forward. So let's see how it goes. That's point. On the issue of internet blocking, I think today, free and open internet is something which is absolutely necessary, largely to make sure that those who are, everyone is able to onboard the digital system. But like Anya mentioned, you can't have an internet which actually discriminates women. And to that extent, you will need to have some kind of rules of the game. On data, you need some kind of rules of the game. Similarly, now that when you're talking of universal internet, both in terms of people and things and in terms of economic and social activities that humankind do, the impact is tremendous. When the impact is tremendous, people who want to misuse this, yesterday a lot of senior leaders talked about using cyberspace for, or some people trying to use cyberspace for cyber terrorism, cyber radicalization, and other cyber crimes. With the pervasiveness of internet, you can't allow that to happen, because the nation states have responsibility towards the citizen to protect them. And therefore, they would be need to take whatever steps that are necessary to protect the life and property of people. The problem, I think, today is a little bit technology related also. Question is, you need internet for everything. And I'm sorry for a long answer to this short question, but when you stop internet, a lot of essential services, I can't do my digital payment, I can't do my educational courses, I can't do a lot of positive things. So really, I think we need to, and this technological solution will evolve, where we should be able to control, certain specific let's say to control a law and order situation for which, let's say, internet blocking takes place sometimes in certain localized areas. You have more effective mechanisms to localize the control you need rather than doing a broad sweep of control. You can do it in localized area in that particular colony of houses where it is done. You should be able to do it for those kind of activities which you need to block and need not have to do a blanket shutdown. That could be able to, and a technological solution would be very useful in this regard. Thank you.
So we are going to take just one more question, and I'm sorry, not everyone is going to be able to have their question answered, but you can also interact with us during the breaks. Okay, over here, thank you.
Hi, hello. Leah Casper from Global Partners Digital in the UK. We are here at a conference that is talking a lot about cybersecurity, and my question is to anyone who would like to address it. How do we square the need to address cyber threats and protect our systems and assets and ultimately users from cyber threats, and the need, on the other hand, to protect a free and open internet? Thanks.
Actually, I'll give a very partial answer to that, and it's because I also wanted to add something to what Dr. Kumar responded to Dr. Govind's question. I think it's a very good example, the issue of internet shutdowns, where I would argue that in many cases a shutdown is actually a disproportionate response. But I can also see that if you are, say, a police officer in that specific area where there is a real threat of violence or property might get destructed, that you feel you need to do something now and that you will use the means at your disposal. And why I think it's a really important example actually to highlight how I really think when we talk about multi-stakeholderism, we need to continue to deepen that system. And not in the moments when the crisis is already happening, but I think there is great value in all of these challenges when it comes to this balancing, to have more people in the room together. Everybody who feels that they are affected by a possible measure and who have ideas to resolve this. Because I think if law enforcement can sit together with groups also that they don't get a chance to have conversations with so often, we will come up with new ideas that make sure that they need to resort to such measures far less often, if at all, and that still the very real threats that they need to deal with will still be addressed. That was the limited point I wanted to mention on that question.
I'd also add, with reference to the previous question and this one, that internet shutdowns and takedowns and various responses to cybersecurity threats are going to be a fact of life. And what we should look at is to take principles from the real world as to how these things are carried out, and specifically in terms of transparency and predictability, rule of law, and so forth. And that's where the Manila Principles is actually a very powerful document, a product of a multi-stakeholder process, which says exactly that if these things are going to be done by authorities, then they need to be done according to well-understood principles, rule of law, transparency, etc. And that's a completely reasonable expectation that is very well supported by civil society, by industry, and I'd hope by government as well. So the Manila Principles really, I think, should go a lot further than it has already so far. Thank you.
Thank you. May I? So my name is Kees van Baar.
Sorry, we are out of time, but perhaps...
If I may just add one, I think there is a tremendous need to, give higher priority to the whole issue of cybersecurity. And that's one. And so in the minds of all decision makers across all stakeholders, I don't think it's getting adequate priority even now. And the second thing which I want to say is there is a huge need for capacity building. There is not enough manpower available worldwide to be able to address the kind of requirements of cybersecurity that arise. And both these things need to, the world collectively needs to work and bring and make this happen.
I'm the Dutch Human Rights Ambassador for human rights. And I think it's a very good remark. And I'm really happy that we have a multi-stakeholder panel over here. But I would like to say that when we talk about cybersecurity, security goes hand in hand with human rights. It's not one or the other. And you don't need to, construct and think of all new regulations, because regulations are there. Regulations and rights are offline. And when they're offline, they also count on online. We don't need to have, new ideas or new rights. And I like what Paul was saying on this issue. And I heard the Manila Principles, which to me they are very, I think it's a good thing that we have such a thing. And that is what I would like to stress. Rights offline are also rights online. And therefore you cannot, like you cannot just take away newspapers, you cannot have shutdowns. You just say right now in this day and age of digital economy, you just make a society lame for the moment. Thank you.
I thank the speakers for their unique perspectives on the idea of an open and free internet for all. Now, as a token of our appreciation, I would like to request Mr. T. Santosh, Additional Director, and Mr. Rahul Gusain, Director, from the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, to present our speakers with a memento. Mr. Rahul Gusain to Dr. Rj Kumar. Mr. T. Santosh to Professor Pradeep Kapur. Mr. Rahul Gusain to Paul Wilson. Mr. T. Santosh to Jeremy Malcolm. And Mr. Rahul Gusain to Dr. Anya Kovacs.